Welcome to Safe Spaces, the podcast brought to you by Women's Health in Women's Hands Community Health Center. Join us as we delve into crucial conversations about gender-based violence, featuring survivors, advocates, and community members to raise awareness and offer insights on this crucial issue affecting our communities. We are your hosts, Leslie
and Tommy Lola. Safe Spaces is presented by the GBV Prevention and Cure Cascade Program, supported by funding from Women and Gender Equality Canada. Tune in to this podcast series, available on all major podcast platforms and our website, flourishaccess.ca.
Please be aware that this podcast covers sensitive topics such as domestic abuse and gender-based violence. To protect the privacy and safety of our guests, some have chosen to remain anonymous. The content of this podcast is suitable for those aged 16 plus. There is a disturbing trend among violent perpetrators in which they use a third party to inflict harm on their victims. Have you ever thought about the term used to describe when an abuser extends their violence to others rather than directly attacking the victim themselves? Today, we are joined by Fernanda to explore a critical form of gender-based violence that often goes unrecognized. Psychologist Sonia Vaccaro defines vicarious violence as violence that is exercised against children to hurt women. Before we jump into this discussion, Fernanda, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hello. Thank you so much for this space. I'm really grateful to be here and have the opportunity to talk more about vicarious violence. I'm a Latin woman and I have been working in multiple projects that aims to support Latin women in Canada to succeed, and especially women who have experienced gender-based violence and that are survivors. And also part of my work is to do advocacy, community work for refugee women. So thank you so much for this space.
Thank you for joining us, Fernanda. So research has shown that repeated exposure to vicarious violence can lead to desensitization, increased aggression, and decreased empathy in individuals. Can you please explain to our listeners what vicarious violence is?
For sure. As Leslie was saying at the beginning of the conversation, vicarious violence is defined by Sonia Vaccaro. She is an Argentinian woman that is living in Spain and that he has been working with gender-based violence survivor and a clinical psychologist. And she refers to a form of gender-based violence where the primary target is a woman, but the harm is inflicted through others. And in some of the cases are children or the loved one, and this violence is extended even to the pets or any form of love that women have. And it's really sad because the abuser aim to cause severe emotional pain to the women, and where women don't have control of those actions or of this pain.
Thank you for that explanation. It really truly is a sad concept that men feel the need to inflict violence on another in order to inflict pain, and at times torture on women. The violence is secondary to the main victim, which is often a woman, but it's still the woman who is going to get harmed at the end of the day, especially if they end up losing a child, a close family member, as you said, a pet. So it's also a form of abuse on children if we think about it, because they are often the victims of vicarious violence.
Yes, it's true. It's a really cruel method of exerting control and inflicting suffering from others, especially those who are vulnerable like children. Some of the cases, this violence is going through individuals who are in disabilities or who may face certain health conditions that they are not able to protect themselves. So it's also really sadly because the perpetrator is also the husband, but the father as well. And in Latin American context, many children are killed by the father because of vicarious violence. And I think it's really important to mention that when we talk about vicarious violence, can be a little bit confusion between family violence that are quite similar. But in this one is that, both are suffering, such as the direct victim and the secondary. But the main focus is to harm women and in these cases, mothers. So it's really devastating.
Thank you for showing that distinction between vicarious violence and family violence. It is very important folks to understand the difference. And thank you for pointing out the word power and control, because truly the main goal of vicarious violence is to show that they have the power and dominance, and as a way to control. Because even if it does not end up in the killing of a second person or the secondary victim, it could be a way of controlling the woman to do certain things and behave a certain way by threatening, let's say, her children, or as you said, other vulnerable individuals like elderly people, people who have disability, because the abuser is able to control a woman by saying that I'm going to harm this person, I'm going to do this to this person.
Yeah, and also is really often common on the process of divorce. Some of the things that maybe some people can think like, okay, maybe the vicarious violence will finish after women are flee the situation or are moving away. But sadly, it doesn't work that way in case of they having the custody or in certain contexts, for example, as I said, a Latin American context where there is a divorce process after separation and all of these, the men is still having the power to play with this dynamic of vicarious violence after divorce, maybe taking the custody and not let them see the women, see their children, or financial barriers. So this is also a really tough topic because it doesn't conclude only with the divorce, it can go after.
Yeah, you're correct about that, because in this part of the world, we do see that a lot during divorce and in custody battle. Children end up being the ones harmed as a way of revenge from the man to the woman, especially maybe he wanted custody, whether joint or full custody. He's not able to get that. And it becomes a behavior of, if I cannot have them, then you cannot have them too.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you both for shedding light on what vicarious violence is and how it affects us all. I heard you touch just a little bit just now on the financial part of it and the financial part of it, how it can affect or impact the woman. I wanted to ask you though, are there any differences in the impact of vicarious violence based on intersectionality?
Thank you for the question. And yes, the impact of vicarious violence also can vary depending on the intersectionality, which can consider different aspects such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, immigration status, or gender intersex individuals. So it's common more often on women that are from marginalized communities that can experience more vulnerability and trauma and long-term impact because of these situations and due to the systematic barriers and inequalities in their country or in the context, and a lot of cultural pressures, and also can come the religion factor. And as a long-term consequences can be the coping mechanisms that women have and how that can affect in the recovery and the lack of access to support, and also with all of the psychological and emotional trauma that they have been facing since the violence started, and how that ends until multiple types of violence that they will come after when the women wants to get legal advice or legal support or start their life again.
Thank you so much for that. We do realize that men, because they're very informed people, right? So because they know that these are some of the obstacles for women, they use it to their advantage to further manipulate and to empower themselves in carrying out these acts. Intersectionality can amplify feelings of vulnerability and fear among those already marginalized, as they may see themselves reflected in the media representations of violence more starkly.
Yeah, what you mentioned is really important to know that men in some of the cases and have the power and control, and they play important role on that because of the money and socioeconomic status, and also how the system, mostly of the cases, is favorable for them. And women, some of the times, they may not get the access and support that they need, so they continue with the relationship, and they will continue with the extended other types of violence, not only with vicarious violence, but also physical violence, emotional, financial. So that often of the cases is affecting marginalized communities, and especially women of color.
Thank you for that. Can you elaborate on how exposure to vicarious violence affects an individual's psychologically and emotionally? Because you just mentioned those terms, so I'd like to know a little bit more.
Yeah, I was doing the research, and some of the survivors have explained that for them it's one of the cruelest ways as mothers, because knowing that her children or loved ones are the ones who are being harmed is devastating, because they don't have no control of that. They feel guilt, despair, and pressure to continue with the perpetrator and abuser, even though they also experience other type of violence, and even know that continue with that relationship would lead to more violence. So this type of violence causes deep trauma, leading to anxiety, depression, PTSD, constantly feeling of fear and feeling vulnerable, and also the sense of powerlessness, that they don't feel they have the power, that they don't feel empowered, they don't feel with the possibility to change their situation, and they feel unable to protect the people that they love, especially their children, and it's really devastating. And also that affect and create scars that is not going easily and result in long-term consequences in their emotionally and psychological well-being.
Yeah, I can imagine that feeling of guilt, powerlessness, and pressure, almost like you being in a dream where you're falling and you can't stop the fall. There's nothing for you to hold on to. I can imagine the weight that will be on a woman's mind, on her chest, knowing that because of her, something is happening to her child or her family member. It really is a horrible feeling that might make it difficult for them to like differentiate between fantasy and reality, or might make them internalize violent behaviors as a coping mechanism. Because I find that there are times when you feel pain, but you don't feel physical pain. So it's even harder to put it in words, harder to cope with it.
Exactly. You give it in the point like, yeah, I'm suffering a lot, but this violence that people can recognize is not going into me, is through people that I love, like my children. But also I'm experiencing a lot of psychological trauma because I don't have control over that. And I'm feeling guilty because if I'm doing something wrong or anything I do can be a reason for them to attack the people that I supposed to take care of. And it's like, yes, you're a wife, but you're also a mother, but also you're a woman. And that is not like a balance between these three in a relationship with this type of perpetrators. And it's a lot of pain and suffering. So that's why I think it should be more conversation of vicarious violence, because it's really unique and really difficult to support the survivors because of this intersectionality and these multiple violence that are happening at the same time.
Especially it will be difficult if the woman is being threatened that if she says something, if she tries to seek help, that there will be further violence inflicted on her or the individual who is being impacted by vicarious violence. It truly is a very tragic situation for anyone to be in.
I agree with you both on that. I can just imagine from a parent's point of view that you're maybe at work and you're getting threatening text messages, or you like your child is at school, whatever may happen to the children. Even sometimes here in Canada, sometimes you see like these Amber Alerts come in and the kids are taken by the other parent. I remember in one instance some years ago, maybe about years ago, there was this instance where a dad actually abducted the child. They were having some altercation between the mom and the dad actually took the child for her birthday actually and didn't return the child. And when they found the child, the next day the child was dead, right? So I can just imagine that that's a lot of suffering, and there's this real sense of helplessness. There's nothing you can do, right? And on so many levels, that's even more, I don't know. I mean, like physical harm, like I always say, like if you get a slap on the wrist, if you have a scratch or something, you can apply some cream or you can take some painkillers, something. But when you're suffering emotionally and psychologically, there is not too much that you're able to do, right? And like vicarious violence, based on, what we've learned and what we've seen, really is a terrible thing. And it really is a topic that we don't discuss too often. So I'm very happy that we're able to have this conversation today and to build awareness around this particular topic. I wanted to ask you, Fernanda, how does witnessing or hearing about violence affect individuals, particularly women, and their perceptions of safety and security?
For women that experience vicarious violence or that are witnesses or hearing about vicarious violence can affect their perception of safety and security. And you also give a really good example of how vicarious violence can be extreme modality, and in this case is the murder of a children. And for example, survivors, that's like a really great example when children go into the school and you may think that your children is safe, right? But a survivor of vicarious violence, a lot of emotions can come and fear if their children are out of their home, right? Because yeah, for other people will be they safe. But for them, they also don't have control over that and they may think that their father will go to the school and because they're the father, they can take the children away and do something horrible to them that they may not be able to even look after them. This type of violence directly attacks their perception of the safety, the sense of control. They can make them feel constantly on edge and fearful for their well-being. And women are always feeling alert and anxious. So some people can say like, oh, maybe this person is always anxious and she's looking around and she's checking the phone and she wants to have control over the children, but this is the fear that they having or protect them because they don't know what can happen if they're not around because the father or the husband may have the control over the children as well to harmful even if there is not the presence of her. So also this violence, as we said in the divorce, if the father have access to the children, they also can continue with the violence, even though the women are not see and are not the presence of the violence, but she may imagine that is still happening. And that is a lot of pressure on her, a lot of fear that can lead on something more devastating. And yeah, that's a lot of overwhelming sense of insecurity and can also limit their ability to lead a normal life, affecting their mental health and daily basis.
Thank you so much. Research has shown that exposure to violence, whether through direct experiences or vicarious exposure, can lead to increased feelings of fear and anxiety, especially for women. Witnessing acts of violence, including gender-based violence, can reinforce harmful gender stereotypes and norms, contributing to a culture that tolerates and perpetuates violence against women. That's actually one that, like a very important point because women feel safe in so many different ways and in like so often. So even if something isn't directly happening in your immediate home, just to know that women are being abducted, are being raped, are being trafficked, like just to know that that's something that is existing around you really does drive fear. Because I know for me personally, there was a time when it was all that was happening, and like when you're watching the news a lot and you're seeing all these things coming out in the news and stuff like that, it made me not want to go outside. It makes me want to leave from work and come straight home. It makes me want to isolate myself because it's in my head, it's scary out there. So I know that, like this is something that affects a lot of women. And well, we're speaking specifically about women just because like women are usually more vulnerable. So thank you so much again for bringing to light those important points.
No, thank you, Leslie. You said something really important. Like, yeah, for vicarious violence survivors, those are the typical feelings that they have. But also as women, witnessing or hearing about gender-based violence affect us in the way that how we have the perception of men. Some of women they don't feel safe around men. They don't know how to interact with them. You're going to somewhere outside and you don't feel safe. You feel that something may happen to you just because you're a woman. And also women, even in their own homes, living alone, they have this feeling that something can happen, right? This anxious, that this overwhelming that you need to be alert all the time, especially if you are going in the night and you have this lack of freedom that you may not do certain things because of the consequences that unfortunately are happening, right? Like if you're going tonight or if the clothes that you choose, they may, cause other feelings. And it's really, really sadly that women have extra precaution. And even some of them, I have heard that they feel safe if they're going with a man out. But if they're going alone, they feel that something can happen. And it's like a really confusion, right? The way that we perceive men, like sometimes they can be protective people that you feel safe around, and that they can take care of you if something may happen. But in other way, we have also seen that these men are the ones that also are murdering and are killing, are threat and affect women in their well-being. So it's really, really a lot of emotions that women are having when we talk about violence.
It's a very important point that you make, Fernanda, about, and Leslie as well, about the coping and being afraid and it impacting at times your daily life. What are some ways that individuals who are struggling as a result of vicarious violence learn to cope, or what are services that might be available to them to ensure that they're able to overcome their struggles?
I think for the coping mechanisms, they really need to have a strong community support. It's really important that people who are experiences, who are survivors or that are current on that situation, they have a strong support groups that they can provide information for them, resources. And talking about Canada, we have seen that there's some organizations like Women's Health and Women's Hand that being focused on gender-based violence and address this issue with care and understanding. So it's really important that those individuals receive the information, that they can know the resources available, and that flee from the violence, it doesn't need to end up in a legal procedure, that they understand that there are other ways to ending the violence. And it's really crucial to raise awareness of that, but also that women can feel safe to share their stories and find solidarity among other women, that they can find the resources in case that they need legal assistance, that they can have a safety planning, something really, really important that they can do with the care and understanding the reasons of the safety planning and how important it is to ensure the safety in a long term, and accessing to shelter, basic needs such as food and clothing, but also really important that individuals, especially therapists or counselors, peer support, they have a trauma-informed therapy, and they have a really important cultural approach, that they understand the reasons of why this happened or why in this context, and having a lot of patience and comprehensive and understanding on this issue. So it's really important that people are aware of that, especially if they're working on the field and they're aiming to support women. But especially as a friend, if you're not familiar with community work, social work, or health, that you can be just a way to support them and introduce them with a specialist. But if you are a friend and you want to support somebody that you see has going to vicarious violence or gender-based violence, that you can just listen them, providing the information. Don't get angry with them if you see that the situation is happening over and over again, that you need to be there for them. Because in the case that you refuse to helping them, so you're just gonna put her on more risk, and she's gonna continue feeling lonely. In case that you see that this violence is extreme from the children, so that you may need to call child services, that they can find the better way to address this issue. So it's a little bit confusion, right? Because yeah, she's your friend, but in case that is children involved, the situation turns a little bit more complicated. That everything need to be with care and understanding. I think that will be the best way to address this issue and to support survivors.
Yeah, community support and support groups is very important. I think like in terms of vicarious violence, similar to how we often find like support groups for individuals and community members impacted by gun violence. I think there needs to be similar concept for vicarious violence. It's not a concept, a word that's often used here in Canada, but I think there needs to be more conversation about it, because if we see on the news that, fortunately, like the example that Leslie gave, a father kidnaps their child and kills them, unfortunately, that woman has experienced vicarious violence, and it should be categorized as such. And we should start recognizing it as such so that there can be better support for them. I know that encouraging individuals to engage in self-care activities is always good for coping with traumatic experiences, such as exercising, meditation, relaxation techniques. They can help reduce stress and promote emotional well-being. And then learning also to establish boundaries with media exposure or situations that might trigger or distress an individual is also very important for managing emotional responses and prevent re-traumatization. I do know that at times folks who have experienced violence and the news is covering a story about violence, it can re-trigger them. So knowing what your triggers are so you can step away is very important for emotional response and preventing re-traumatization.
Thank you, Tomilola. And thank you so much, Fernanda, for joining us for this discussion about the devastating phenomenon of vicarious violence, particularly the dangerous ways it manifests in society. Vicarious violence often refers to the violence that is exercised against children as a means to inflict pain on women, a disturbing cycle that perpetuates trauma and suffering across generations. In this context, we explored how children witness or experience violence aimed at their mothers, which not only impacts their immediate well-being but also shapes their understanding of relationships and conflict. This cycle reinforces harmful gender dynamics and emphasizes the urgent need for awareness, intervention, and support systems that protect children and women from such violence. As we wrap up this episode, let's continue to raise our voices against vicarious violence and work towards a society where emotional and physical safety is a right for all.
Thank you, Fernanda, very much for joining us for today's conversation. It was really meaningful.
No, thank you, Tamila and Leslie. It was really nice to have this conversation. I also would like to point out that the support and self-care activities are or avoid triggers is really important. And thank you for the space. Thank you for giving the opportunity to talk about vicarious violence that is very overseen. And so I appreciate that.
Thank you, Fernanda. This topic was well needed. We needed to have this conversation. As we said earlier in this conversation as well, that vicarious violence is not often spoken about, right? I'm pretty sure this conversation is going to build a lot of awareness around it, and it's going to reach so many homes and so many people, and then they're going to be able to put their fingers on, what their experiences have been, and they'll be able to identify that, okay, this has been vicarious violence. I'm pretty sure a lot of persons were not familiar with the term before now. A lot of persons didn't even understand what it meant and what it is. So thank you so much. Very interesting conversation. We really appreciate you coming and being a part of the program. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity and for the space and also the consideration. Like I was a little bit worried because vicarious violence is such a complicated topic, but thank you for all the comments and make this conversation very easy to discuss. So I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. In our next episode, we will explore the healing and recovery of violence survivors and how they can be supported during the journey.